glad to see everybody here. Those of you, I'm sure you kind of know the title, what this is about. This is going to kind of examine Darger's scholarship over the years. Darger, not his scholarship, but what scholars have done with Darger since he was first discovered. It's not going to be a complete listing of everything, but I hope to kind of hit the highlights, just a general indication of the trends over the years that have happened since really the first exhibition of his work in 1977. Just as a way to kind of look at it a little bit for me, and I'm a recovering art critic, so I tend to sort of make judgments about things, and so I'm really trying to do better about that, and I'm trying to kind of just make this kind of an evaluation so that it's an insightful kind of thing as to how good was the scholarship, how was it effective, what kind of scholarship was it, and so I'll kind of just be making very quick comments about that. There's really three kinds of scholarship going on with the work, at least the way I've organized it. The first kind would be like a descriptive, art historical, or just artistic or historical view or overview of Darger's life and work. That would be like the basic kind of thing that the majority of newspaper articles and essays dealt with. Those who were more ambitious would do a second kind of scholarship that would be more probing, perceptive. These would be evaluations that would go beyond that and come up, maybe try and dig deeper into the workings behind this phenomenon of Darger and his work. The third kind is the rarest of all. There's only two examples in this entire slideshow of extensive, groundbreaking, and insightful analysis of Darger. I think that's happened a couple of times. In my opinion, it happened with McGregor, and it's also happening with a current book that is not yet published, but it's about to be published in July. I'll tell you more about that when we get to it. So, let's go back, take the Wayback Machine, go way back to 1977. Now just know, as Joel said, Darger died in 1973, born in 1892, died in 73. That's when his work was first discovered. It took about 4 years for Nathan Lerner and people who were first learning about this work to kind of, they were awed, they were shocked, they were so moved by what they encountered. I think they were just so taken aback they didn't even know what to do with it or how to deal with it. But within 4 years' time, there was in fact one of the original people that was on the scene in 77, possibly earlier this year today, Michael Baruch. Michael, if you want to contribute anything, please, feel free, because I wasn't there in 77. I came in about 1980, or 1979 is when I first became aware of it. But back in 1977, there was an exhibition at the Hyde Park Art Center. And it was organized by, it was curated by C.L. Morrison, but I'm sure it was with a lot of help from Nathan Lerner. And they did a catalog, which this is the cover for it here, Realms of the Unreal, the work of Henry Darger. This is done a very cheap newsprint. Let's see, I'll go forward.
You just said the cursor.
The cursor, okay. So, I thought it was this. Where's, oh, I see. No, wait. Oh, wait. Sorry. So, hit this again, will go away. How can I get rid of it? Let's go away. Okay, I did. It's gone. This is like a sample page from the inside. They didn't pull any punches. I mean, they showed his heavenly fairylands as well as his hellish battle scenes in this first catalog in 1977. It's probably hard to see it on these because the reproduction in itself was not very clear, but this is, of course, a reproduction, so you're not going to see it. But those familiar with Darger's work can see the children disemboweled, eviscerated, crucified. they basically wanted to just show exactly what Darger was about, what he was up to. Michael, did you take this little photograph down here? Is that yours? Yes. So the room was documented, the work was photographed, and C.L. Morrison got the byline for the article. The article is an example of that first kind of work. It's a good overview of what Darger was about. It was really the first time anybody had really explained Darger to anybody, any readers and the general public. So it was a good job. It was fairly extensive. After that, really the first major article that, in my opinion, that really explicated his work and really examined it from a art historical perspective was done by Jack Burnham for the New Art Examiner. Jack Burnham was a professor at Northwestern University at the time. He was a major art historian, published several art historical books, Structure of Art, Great Salt Works, major Marcel Duchamp scholar. So he was able to view Darger from an art historical perspective and evaluated his work. He's an example, I would say, of the second kind of criticism, above and beyond just an overview, but really a probing, extensive analysis. Nothing really groundbreaking here, but I mean, he mentioned things like he really was able to give Darger a view on Darger from, as I said, an art historian's point of view that was accepting of it, accepting of this as bona fide, aesthetic, important work. He didn't try to analyze it and try to compare it to mainstream or quote high art, academic art. But he did say that he said there were maybe a half a dozen experiences in his life where his breath was taken away by an exhibit. One was the Calder exhibit at the Guggenheim, another was the Matisse show at MoMA, the Munch Museum in Oslo. These were experiences for him where he was just awed by what he encountered. And he said seeing this show at the Hyde Park Art Center was just such an experience for him. And he said he'd been to see the Collection d'Art Brut in Lausanne, which houses all the great art brut artists historically collected by Duchamp. Dubuffet, Jean Dubuffet. And he said that none of those people, including Otto Wolfli, none of these people compared, in his opinion, to the kind of work that Henry Darger did. Darger was over and above the kind of psychiatric art, even great psychiatric art that he had encountered in Europe. So he said really, to him Darger was more akin to someone like William Blake and also Henri Rousseau, in his opinion. So this was, as I said, it's really the first real examination of his work in an art historical light. That was followed, and again, this was in 1979 was when Burnham's article came out, 2 years after that exhibition. Not really too much happened in those ensuing 2 years. There were some other exhibitions of his work. There might have been some other write-ups. Nothing significant that I can tell. Another one of these write-ups in 1979 occurred at the Chicago Reader by a woman by the name of Ina Jaffe. Another general overview, nothing really outstanding, just another sort of, well, this is what his life was about, this is what the work looks like, rehashing really what had already been written prior to that. So, things quiet down, nothing really happens for another 6 years. In 1985, I was writing for Art in America at that point, and I wrote a this is the index for that issue. Chicago Originals was an article I wrote for Art in America. It was the first national exposure that Darger had received. Now, prior to that, he had been exhibited in Europe. He was collected over there in a minor way. He was exhibited in New York, but there was no real scholarship on him. There was no real journalistic or art historical scholarship nationwide. It was more or less localized in like Chicago or New York, or there were catalogs produced. But in terms of a publication that was really getting the word out, Art in America, Art Forum, even New York Times, nobody had done it until I did this one, and I think really, and it was very brief. It was I got to say that really is pretty much the first kind of scholarship. Just another overview, because I was also writing about Joseph Yoakum and Lee Godey in this article. But the one contribution I'm very proud of, and the one that has been probably my major contribution early on to the scholarship, was the discovery of the photograph of Elsie Parobeck, which was the main driving force in Darger's Realms of the Unreal. Darger lost a photograph of a little girl that he was using as a model for the major child martyr, Annie Ehrenberg, in Realms of the Unreal. In real life, he thought someone stole it or he had lost it, and he became so obsessed with the loss of this photograph that he wrote the murder and the loss of that photograph into the realms. He actually entered the realms himself, and the crossover between life and art became entirely blurred for Darger, and the whole motivating force for the continuation of the writing of the saga, the epic that made it so entirely long, was the fact that he was pleading for God to return this photograph. It was not returned, and so he kept continuing the wars, the carnage, and the story, and introducing new characters, and it went on because he could not find this photograph. So what I did is I went back to microfilm, Chicago Daily News, the Art Historical Society, and was able to find this on microfilm and establish that it was Elsie Parobeck, which was the photograph that he had lost, and that was later on confirmed by the fact that with more research we found out that he had actually named towns and battles after Parobeck. So he was familiar with Parobeck, and that connection was made. 1985, that's Art in America. In basically another 10 years go by before really anything significant happens. During this time, however, I spoke with McGregor. He had read my article. He was reading other things about Darger. That was what got McGregor interested in it, and he began working on what would be ultimately his magnum opus on Henry Darger, his own scholarly study, which remains to be probably the definitive Darger book, which I'll talk about in a minute. But he first begins to publish articles about him in 1995, 1996. In Raw Vision, he publishes this very early article about Darger, which is kind of a sort of a consolidation of an article, of an essay he did for a book published in Europe and only translated in French. It was never translated in English. But in this first article, he made the infamous statement that he would never ever be able to live down. And I'm going to be making much of this, probably too much of it, but at the time and it still remains to be the one thing we think about when we think of McGregor and Darger, unfortunately. And that is, well, I'll just read it here. Projected onto the Glandolinians, this is from that Raw Vision article, projected onto the Glandolinians are the monstrous drives of a serial killer. Darger's obsessional involvement with disemboweling of children, almost invariably little girls, is understandable in terms of the early birth fantasies concerning the destructive implications of his mother's pregnancy, with the birth of a girl child resulting in her death. At no point does he ever reveal any awareness of methods of having children other than adoption. And Darger's violent, sadistic impulses and his increasingly bizarre conception of adoption not found adequate expression in his alternate world, he might well have moved into action, with the results too terrifying to contemplate. And he has a footnote. In the footnote, he says, the serious implications of this fact led me to review all child murders in the Chicago area, and particularly that of Elsie Parobeck, abducted and killed in 1911, a murder in which Darger took an extraordinary personal interest. So what McGregor is doing right from the get-go is he's taking a very psychoanalytical point of view, emphasizing the pathological aspects of Darger, taking Darger's work and reading what Darger has done in his work, and then projecting that back onto Darger's personality and wondering if, was he really a serial killer? Could he have actually murdered children in the way that he depicts? Okay, I'll hold back on commenting about that for now. Let's just move on. This is the book that was kind of foreshadowed in that article. This only came out in French. I pulled this off. I couldn't scan it on my scanner, so I pulled this up. I want to have a small thing off the internet. But McGregor gave me a translation, and this is, and again, he repeats this. This is from the translation of that book. Child slaves are stripped, starved, and murdered. At times, such accounts are frequent in later volumes. One senses within Darger a potential for mass murder. It was, however, a potential defended against by his intense devotion, his absolute conviction of Jesus and the power of God. Now, this is not to say that this is the only perception, the only thing that McGregor was emphasizing, but it was the one that everybody came away from, and it was a sensationalistic kind of statement to make. And it's one that continued to haunt him, continued to be come up whenever his name came up in his scholarship. Okay, so that was basically 96. Things are starting to heat up now because largely because McGregor, major scholar, major art historian, psychologist, is dealing with the work. Stephen Prokopov at the University of Iowa puts together the first great retrospective traveling show of Henry Darger's work called Henry Darger, The Unreality of Being. This is the cover for that catalog, basically just a reproduction of Darger's work. This show traveled around the country, went not only to New York, came here to Chicago. They added many cities onto the itinerary. It was an awesome show. It was truly the breathtaking show that the breathtaking work that that had been basically foreshadowed. People had read about the work. People had seen small reproduction of the work. But not many people had seen that first Hyde Park Art Center show. And even that show was not as extensive as this one. This one, when it came here, took up the entire fourth floor of the Cultural Center, and it was magnificent. And if any of you have never seen a lot of Dargers in one place, I don't think you can really say you've seen Darger. You just see one or two here and there. Yes, they're amazing. But when you see 40 or 50, when you're in a room surrounded by them, and you really see the intensity of it all, there's really no question about that you're in the presence of a great master genius artist. And I don't use that word lightly. I'm really, okay, I'll stop right now. Okay, so at this point, the reviews start pouring in. New York Times starts writing about Darger incessantly. Magazines begin to address him. I wasn't able to find Arthur Danto's his article in The Nation in 1997, but one of the things he said was that Darger was a genius of stammering achievement. Holland Carter, Pulitzer Prize-winning art critic for the New York Times, Pretty much just does what everybody else does. He doesn't overview the whole thing, doesn't do any really probing work. He does emphasize the sinister, sadistic elements in Darger. This seems to be the thing that seems to stick in everybody's craw, especially if one wants to take a very highly moralistic or narrow point of view about him. The idea that he was a potential pedophile, that that could have been a child murderer, and this, this was not help these kinds of things in terms of having a balanced view of what this work was about. So yeah, Tessa DiCarlo, we're 1997 now. She does a piece for the New York Times, and here's a little excerpt from it, but not a little long one, but it kind of gives you an overview of what was going, the thinking and the sort of what was happening, and I'll read that in case it's a little hard to read. Taking on outsiders like Darger means tackling difficult issues. For example, when the retrospective, this is the Unreality of Being, was originally mounted a year ago at the University of Iowa Art Museum, the director, Stephen Prokopov, included one violent picture, and one that one was relatively tame. Prokopov said, "We felt there wasn't a need to show the pictures of kids being killed and hanged and disemboweled because that's a relatively small part of Darger's work," he says. "Sometimes people make more of the psychological aspect than the aesthetic aspect. But I think it's the aesthetic aspect that holds our attention." She goes on to write that Mr. McGregor harshly criticized this decision. McGregor said, "People expect to see the real Darger, not the censored version," he says. "If all you do is grab the pretty images without giving a damn what they mean, then you make everything cutesy and quirky. Then everything can be folk art," unquote. The New York show has added a number of Darger's more horrifying scenes. So in New York, they embellished it with by getting collectors to donate works and galleries to donate pieces that were more challenging, more edgy, more violent, to kind of balance it out a little bit. This is a statement from Wertkin, the director of the Folk Art Museum. "The children are fighting for freedom and for everything good," Mr. Wertkin says. "And in the end, this does prevail, so the work is ultimately redemptive rather than simply dark. But so often it's the violence that gives the work its power," unquote. Mr. McGregor, an art historian with a training in psychiatry, traces the artist's obsession with little girls to the fact that just before his 4th birthday, his mother died, and he gave up the birth of the girl, who was given up for adoption before Darger ever saw her. Mr. McGregor believes that Darger channeled the intense feelings of loneliness, abandonment, desire, and rage into his fictional world. Psychologically, this is a quote, "Psychologically, Darger was undoubtedly a serial killer," unquote, he says. "I don't think he acted, however, because if he'd ever started, he would not have been able to stop. Instead, he sublimated it into his art," unquote. Mr. Wertkin says he is troubled to hear somebody whose opinion he respects saying that. Quote, "I hope he is wrong, but in the end, I think the art is beautiful and transcendent, and I'm happy about the museum exhibiting it." These are ironic words because later, the Museum of American Folk Art would be in major financial trouble, and they could have been rescued. This is 2 or 3 years ago. They could have been rescued, except that one of the major donors did not like the fact that they had taken on Darger's work and would not loan them the money to save that museum. So consequently, they had to leave that building. They are now housed in one of their smaller buildings. They're making a comeback. They still have a strong organization. They don't have that big, beautiful Gothic building next to MoMA in New York. Although I never really cared for that building myself, but it was an awesome presence, and it really allowed them to show work in a big way. But so those who stuck their necks out for Darger sometimes paid a price, and the Museum of American Folk Art, which courageously did so by adding a major collection of Darger's work to their collection, suffered the consequences in the end. But I think it was still a good thing to do. And it's still not today the major repository for the writings, a lot of the artwork. Nobody in Chicago came forth. Nathan Lerner attempted for years to get museums here interested in preserving this work. Nobody was interested. Nobody saw fit or had the vision to do that, but ultimately the American Folk Art Museum did. And so now that original quote in Jack Burnham's essay, another, what was it? The Henry Darger collection, another art treasure lost to Chicago ? Yeah, in 1977 it was a question mark. Yes, it was lost. That was, ultimately he was pleading at the end of that essay for major donors, major collectors to come forth, a major museum to come forth and take on this work. Unfortunately, nobody did, and we lost it. Robert Hughes, during this great response to Darger, also weighed in on Darger, A Life of Bizarre Obsession in 1997. Now here is a little quote from his article in Time magazine. It would be easy in these prurient days to think of Darger as merely a compulsive old pervert, a sort of poussin of pedophilia. Now anybody who knows Hughes loves to just kind of come out with these really clever little statements. He paid for this too because he would be misquoted. The poussin of pedophilia. Now notice that he said it would be easy to think Darger merely as a compulsive, a sort of poussin. It would be easy to think of that. Of course, he's saying, but we shouldn't think of him as that way. And yet now he is saddled with this quote as him saying it as if he believed it. And actually, he was actually referring to people who said that had a limited point of view. So beware of being too clever, because you will be misquoted. It will be taken out of context. I know from experience. One art historian come psychiatrist, McGregor, opined in the New York Times that, quote, psychologically Darger was undoubtedly a serial killer, unquote. A wildly irresponsible judgment, since practically nothing is known about his character, and in any case, he never harmed a fly, much the same. And on the same evidence could be said about the authors of the Old Testament. So Hughes' argument is that just because you write and illustrate horrible violence doesn't mean that you believe in it or would act on it. Every novelist, every movie maker who ever depicted graphic violence, does that mean they're all serial killers? And why was Darger treated differently than anybody else who depicts horrific violence? Why was it suddenly, oh, he really believes that, he really is that way? Why would you even entertain that idea? Only because McGregor, who was a scholar in the field of outsider art, the field that is largely comprised, not entirely, but largely of mentally ill patients. Not all of them psycho killers, of course. A few of them are. Not even all of them are. But he couldn't help but want to sensationalize it and go to the worst possible scenario as a possibility. Okay. McGregor continues to write about Darger in The Outsider, Intuit's own publication. This was Thoughts on the Question Why Darger in 1998. Again, the split off the Landolinian portion of Darger's psyche is arguably the mind of a serial killer made visible. As I came to know and accept the side of Darger, I was forced to confront the possibility at the age of 19, having just escaped from the psychiatric institution, he could have been the killer of Elsie Paravec. The serious investigation of this possibility immensely enhanced my study of Darger, at the same time adding a new force to the concept outsider. Would I have undertaken any study of Darger's life and work had I believed him to be the murderer of girls? Yes, I would. Okay. Which brings us to my book in the year 2000. Now, my essay for this book is about 30 pages. It is kind of the type 1 scholarship overview, nothing particularly really probing, although I think it's really kind of a combination of 1 and 2, because I do think I probed deeper. I really tried to give more, I really tried to talk about the source materials I did not entertain psychological theory. I touched on it. As I touched on art history, I touched on many places, but I tried to give a more balanced point of view. And of course I'm up here explaining it. Someone else will be saying, that Bonesteel, his book, piece of trash, whatever. But from my point of view, it's wonderful. And it's balanced. And what I really tried to do in this book is unite the images with the text. Now, up to this point, bits of his text had appeared in many articles. McGregor published the most in his books of Darger's text published anywhere. But I wanted to really publish extensive excerpts so we could really get a taste for what Darger was about, because I knew that nobody would ever be able to understand these images unless they knew the story of the realms of the unreal. Everybody's scratching their heads wondering, what are these little girls with penises? What are these children who are being tortured and strangled? Why is that happening? Is he just a pervert? Is he just crazy? Is he what? Everybody would jump to conclusions about this. Of course, McGregor explained why, to some degree. But I wanted to show why. I wanted people to have that exact experience of reading it for themselves from Darger's own lips and not from an interpreter. So that continues to be my mission. Basically, is to bring more of the text to the forefront, more of the story behind the work, and to get this work more unified. Okay, so this came out in 2000. Up until that point, John McGregor and I had been very good friends. I considered him a friend and a mentor. He shared his ideas about the serial killer stuff. I admit, yeah, it crossed my mind too. I would never go into print like he did. I shared with him my ideas. Like I was thinking, maybe he was a victim of a satanic cult. Maybe the institution had some kind of cult members who were perpetrating all kinds of horrible things. I mean, he had altars, and I was seeing all kinds of things in there, just the way McGregor was kind of seeing things in there. And we talked about that. He ultimately rejected that, and I ultimately did too. Fortunately, I never went into print on it, like he didn't anything with his ideas. But be that as it may, as soon as my book came out, he never spoke to me again, because by this time he was working on his magnum opus. He had probably was close to finishing it. This great study. He wanted to be the first in English, the first book in English he was very afraid that somebody else was going to come out with a major book before he did. And when I was invited to do this book and I saw the opportunity, I said, how can I resist this, And he actually asked me not to publish it before his book was published. And I said, I can't do that. I mean, your book may never be published. Why? He refused to let anybody edit it. He saw it as being just inviolate work, and so he was refused by publishing house after publishing house. Nobody would take it on. He finally did find a publisher in 2002 that finally did do it, and it's wonderful that he did. I'm sorry that he didn't come out with that book before mine did, but I certainly wasn't going to hold back my book. Unfortunately, like I said, that was the end of our relationship when my book came out, and so that professional jealousy unfortunately took over. After my book, a number of books came out. Klaus Biesenbach and Kyoko Lerner did this book called Disasters of War, Henry Darger, Disasters of War, and it's more or less of a picture book more than anything else. It does have a nice essay in it. Biesenbach's essay is a good overview. Again, an overview, a few little insights, but nothing really great. Nothing groundbreaking, certainly. The Folk Art Museum also came out with a book. Let's see, Biesenbach's book, Disasters of War, was in 2001. Mine was in 2001. Also in 2001, Brooke Davis Anderson did this book on the Darger collection at the American Folk Art Museum. Kyoko Lerner, the widow of Nathan Lerner, donated a huge amount of Darger with there, and source materials. All of the written work all went there, and this was kind of the little catalog that went with it. Anderson's essay is nice. Michel Tebos, the director of the Muséum d'Art Brut in Lausanne, who has written fantastic articles about art brut in Europe, wrote, to me, a very disappointing essay for this book. I highly respect him, but this was not his finest hour in this particular publication. So I would say, that if you're looking for nice books on Darger, this one is a nice little book for reproductions, but not scholarship is not above average, really, in many respects. Peter Sheldau, my favorite art critic, when I was an art critic. I would have expected more of him because I used to very much look forward to reading his work. But when he kind of addressed folk art and specifically Darger in this New Yorker article, it was just rather ho-hum, nothing really to write home about. Also in 2002, the Village Voice came out with this article, and this was a real kind of a surprise. Ed Park wrote his article on The Outsiders. It's really a defense of John McGregor. It really tries to justify McGregor's stance on Darger, the point of view that he's always had on Darger, of a highly psychiatric, psychoanalytical point of view, he does a good job of it. But let's look at one little excerpt from it again. He brings up the serial killer mass murderer argument that Darger. But has Darger ever made such claims? He denies it. At the Ehrenberg lecture, he read aloud from a 2000 Times article by Sarah Boxer, and this is what Boxer says. Mr. McGregor has suggested that Darger murdered her, Elsie Karabek, the Annie Ehrenberg model. And this is what McGregor says. It bluntly states that I thought Darger was a kidnapper and murderer of Elsie Karabek, he says, his frustration audible. I've never made such a wild and unprovable statement. And then he cites and dismisses a Wall Street Journal piece for a similarly misleading take. Well, he's right and he's wrong. He never did say, I kidnapped and murdered Elsie Karabek. That's true. Darger never said that. But what did Boxer say? Boxer just repeated what McGregor said. This is Sarah Boxer's 2000 article. He was crazy like a genius. For Henry Darger, everything began and ended with little girls. This is the thing that Darger's referring to. While Darger was obsessed with children in general, he and his only friend, William Schloter, formed a two-man club they called the Children's Protective Society. He was particularly taken with a photograph of Elsie Karabek. Mr. McGregor has suggested that Darger murdered her. Suggested that he murdered her. That's what he did. McGregor has just made that suggestion. He didn't equivocally or unequivocally. He didn't say I did it, or that he did it. And so this is what happens when you play too loose, fast and loose, and clever with words in the public sphere. You get scrutinized, and you may be hoisted on your own petard. You never know. Okay, so finally in 2002, McGregor's great study comes out, to wide acclaim generally, although there were moments in it, well, more than one moment. The major criticism of it is that it was too long. It needed an editor, which he refused to have. It's hard to find things in it. It is just such a giant tome to get through. But it is brilliant. It is, like I said, it is the definitive work on Darger, and any scholar who wants to do work has to match. This is the model, the pinnacle to strive for. And yet again, he repeats, from a in that book, from a psychological standpoint, the split-off glandulinian portion of Darger's psyche is arguably the mind of a serial killer made visible. As I came to know and accept this dark side of Darger, I was forced to confront the possibility, at the age of 19, same thing he's always said, that he could have been the killer of Elsie Perebeck. While surviving documents related to this unsolved murder are insufficient to provide conclusive proof that Darger was or was not involved in her death, my considered opinion is probably that he was not. Well, that's good. Then why did he bring it up, and why did he say it in a more balanced way? We don't know. Of course, nobody paid attention to that. Even Jeff Corey here at Intuit, when he was about to speak here, comes out with a press release, was Henry Darger a child murderer? Author John McGregor lectured Intuit. Did outsider artist Henry Darger kill young Elsie Perebeck on April 18, 1911? So it is this sort of really sensationalistic kind of thing that unfortunately got hung not only on McGregor, but it got hung on Darger. And it seemed to be the one. I know I'm overemphasizing that in this talk, but it was really the predominant thing in people's minds at the time. Darger did this last piece in 2002, after his book came out, which addresses a whole different topic of the Vivian Girls in Chicago. Further Adventures in Chicago Crazy House, the sequel to The Realms that Darger wrote. And he does a nice little write-up in Raw Vision, after which he retires from the field, donates his library here to Intuit here. We have kind of a McGregor Memorial Library of his work, and he goes off to embark on a study of Asian art, Chinese art specifically, Sung Dynasty art, and no longer writes anything about outsider or psychiatric art after that at all. Completely retires from the field. So we don't really hear from McGregor anymore after that. But as things move on, in 2004, 2 years later, Jessica Yu does her magnificent film, In the Realms of the Unreal, The Mystery of Henry Darger. There have been criticisms of this film too. It is not probing scholarly work by any means, but it looks at him in a whole different way visually, so that she really does a lot of extensive examination of his work photographically, so that we really get to see a lot of it in the film. She covers his life, she covers the artwork. She doesn't deal with any of the controversy. She doesn't deal with any scholarship whatsoever. She doesn't quote anybody. She just wants Darger in front of the audience. She does interview a lot of people who knew Darger. I'm also proud to say that one of the people that came out of the woodwork after my book came out was Mary Catherine O'Donnell, who was and I wish she had come out before I wish I'd known her before my book came out, because I would have quoted her. I don't think McGregor did at all. She was subsequently quoted in other scholarship, because she was able to talk about growing up with Darger from the age of 2 on up to a teenage adult. She lived in the rooming house prior to when the Lerners bought that rooming house, and knew Darger as a little child. She and her brother used to sneak into his room and used to listen to the voices coming out of the room. Talked about Darger. I was able to ask her, did Darger ever make any kind of untoward advances with children? Was he ever inappropriate in any way? She says, no, he hated children. He was a cranky old guy. He just yelled at us. He'd tell us, stay out of my room. We used to go in there and steal his toys to play with, and he got angry at us. And so, she confirmed something that I had always suspected, that really, that a lot of this was in his art, in his visual art, in his writings, that yes, it was a projection, probably a projection from his traumatic childhood, the horrors he experienced in the institutions he grew up in, but it remains entirely fiction. So, anyway, great movie. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. I'm still in 19th century. I'm still in 20th century. In the 21st century, The Edlin Gallery comes out with The Sound and the Fury, The Art of Henry Darger. It has an essay by Edward Madrid Gomez, translated in French and English. Gomez, a major scholar, outsider art brut scholar in Europe. Pretty disappointing essay, really says nothing enlightening whatsoever. A relatively humble coffee table book on Darger. In 2009, Klaus Biesenbach, the man who did The Disasters of War with Kyoko Lerner, and is now, at this point, a curator at MoMA, decides to put together a major Darger book. And his essay in this book deals primarily with contemporary art in Darger, how he has influenced contemporary artists. A good topic. I've got to say that I don't think any of the essays in this book, and my own included, is really very noteworthy. I don't think Biesenbach's is there. He gets in a few really good insights, a few really interesting things, but generally, I don't think there's really much to say about Darger's influence on contemporary art. There is some, but beyond that, it doesn't amount to really much of a big deal. Brooke Davis Anderson talks about the source materials, a pretty quotidian, laundry list of things in the Darger collection that influenced Darger's art. My essay, another overview of his art and his life. Carl Watson contributed a brief essay on Darger's autobiography, which is about 200 pages of actual autobiography and another 1,900 pages of pure fantasy about a tornado called Sweetie Pie. Part of those first 200 pages of autobiography are reproduced. Well, they're not reproduced. Darger wrote it out in longhand. He didn't type it. He typed the realms, but he typed some captions for some of the artwork, but he never typed any of his other novels or books. But they decided, he wrote it out longhand, but they decided to do a facsimile of the history of my life as if he had typed it. So in the back of this book there is about, I don't know, a dozen or 20 pages of the history of my life in an old-fashioned typewriter font on some old-fashioned paper to make it look kind of archaic, as if it makes it look really like the pages from the Realms of the Unreal, when in actuality it's a complete fabrication. It probably looks better than reproducing the actual handwritten work. But of course, by doing the typewritten version, it's very clean. Yeah, it's got where the little like where the bees fill in with ink to make one whole little spot. It's got that kind of flawed look to it, like his actual work, like his actual typing did. But of course, it doesn't have all the mistakes, all the crazy things, the grammatical craziness that he did in the Realms. So in that facsimile, he's not. In that facsimile, it's kind of a cleaned up facsimile to boot. So it's a little bit of a false notion, but in any case, it got Darger's actual text out there. Originally, they wanted me to contribute. They wanted me to find places in the Realms that corresponded to the artwork. They wanted to find quotes, say when General Evans is fighting a forest fire with the Vivian girls, and that's mentioned that's described in the Realms, and it's pictured in an image. They wanted to put those together, which I thought was a great idea, but it never manifested because, for one reason or another, Biesenbach felt like not enough synced up, and it was true. Enough. I'd say maybe a half a dozen things were very much corollaries. They were very much things that belonged together. But a lot of the things that Darger did were extrapolations and riffs on things that happened in the Realms, not specific illustrations of specific incidences and scenes. I was only able to find maybe a dozen of those at the most. The rest I came up with like kind of close things that might apply to something that might still work with an image, but wasn't specifically anchored to that text. But he wasn't, for one reason or another, he wasn't happy with that, and maybe it was going to take up too much room. So I think, and I'm only guessing because I wasn't privy to the entire editorial process, but I think it was that point that Carl Watson's essay extended into an actual, the actual use of the autobiography in Darger's own words as the next best thing to kind of anchor the book in the literary aspects of it. Okay, so let's see. In 2009, the same year that the Biesenbach book came out. Oh, and by the way, the Biesenbach book is probably the most magnificent coffee table book on Darger you'll ever want to have. Even though, as I said, the scholarship is not you know, tremendous. It's good. It's good scholarship, but this is the best reproductions you were ever going to find in any kind of a publication. It's a large format publication. It's as big and thick, almost as big and thick as McGregor's book. Not quite as thick, but it's even a little bit larger. So you can open up that book and you're going to see, you know, these giant reproductions in really rich color, like you've never seen it before. And with each subsequent book, the reproduction of Darger's work gets better and better. With my original 2000 book, it really sucks, really. At the time it came out, I was pretty impressed. But really, compare that to what's being done now, and there's really no comparison. So it's got that going for it. I would recommend it highly if you're going to buy a book. And if Darger's book is out of print. My book is out of print. Those other two coffee table books are still around, but I purchased this if you're thinking of purchasing a Darger book today. Third person, this is the only other thing that I wrote that I really am proud about. Came out in 2009. And I guess we're not going to be able to see, there's not a preview available of that. Do you know why? I'll talk about it. It's in this book, I tried to find source materials that would correspond, literary source materials. So I was using L. Frank Baum's quotations, Lewis Carroll's quotations, Harriet Beecher Stowe from Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I was matching those up with actual things that Darger, how he altered them, how he paraphrased them, or how he embellished them, or how, you know, he just simply lifted it, appropriated it whole hog, and just plunked it down. I also talked about the artwork and other things, but I don't think anybody had done quite the kind of literary analysis like that before. So that's what I'm happy about. So I don't know what we skipped here. Let me see. Okay. Groundwaters, Charles Russell, 2011, came out with this book. Another book, like many other books that I probably haven't mentioned and have not included, books on outsider art that include one essay on Darger. This is one of the better ones. Charles Russell is an excellent scholar. He's written beautiful things about outsider art. His essay on Darger is very good. It's an example of number 2. No groundbreaking stuff, but probing, nice insights, worthy of reading, certainly. In 2000, what year is this? Okay. In 2011-12, I published this piece in Raw Vision, which is really some of the research I did for the Biesenbach book, which was the dramatis personae. All the characters in the realms. That was really what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to take all the characters in the realms and find, you know, quotes about them in the text and match it up with images of them in the work. And like I said, I couldn't really complete that, but I had done the research for it, got paid for it, and so I thought, well, why not? Why let this go to waste? So when McGregor said it was due, they were due for another Darger article, I said, what about this? They said, great. So I was able to do, to really, I couldn't really quote things from the text, but what I did is I spoke about how each character in the realms, when they came in the realms, when they, what volume they came in, and how many of them looked visually when Darger first depicted them. And that was kind of covered in this raw vision piece. Carl Watson, meantime, the guy who did the essay on the history of my life, published this thesis. I don't know if it's a master's or a doctoral thesis on recollecting turbulence, catastrophe, and sacrifice in the history of my life by Henry Darger. So what he began in the Biesenbach book, he continued to research, and he came out with this document on a sort of a dissertation on Darger's history of my life. Now, let's see. Okay, something we're missing here, unfortunately, is Mary Trent. In 2012, she did an essay for the Smithsonian Institution's American Art. And I had about 3 or 4 pages, which for some reason is not turning up, on her article called Many Stirring Scenes, Henry Darger's Reworking of the American Visual Culture. And what she did is she did one of the best essays I've ever read on source materials of Darger. And Brooke Davis Anderson has written about it. As you'll see, Michael Moon has published a book on it. And I don't think any of them did as probing and as insightful a job on as Mary Trent did. And what she did was she actually found scraps of scenes from like Patty McCormick and the Bad Seed, like a movie still that Darger cut out of some newspaper or magazine and kept, and it shows little Patty McCormick, with making a frown on her face. I mean, Darger clipped out everything that had to do with little girls, yes, but he also clipped out all of these ads that came out in the 50s warning parents about stranger danger. So this is before stranger danger. It was about warning them about these men who were stalking young children, because in the 50s, children were starting to be abducted, and their bodies were turning up in horrible conditions, and it was beginning to be somewhat of an epidemic. And so the newspapers and magazines started putting out public service ads that were talking about, keep an eye on your kids, look out for this. And Darger cut these out, and she does just a superb analysis of how Darger's own experience in his life, probably having been abducted and possibly abused before he even entered into the institutions, certainly after he did, how his experiences must have been resonated in these things that he cut out. So it was more than just pictures of kids. The meaning behind them was really explored in a wonderful way. So unfortunately we can't look at that, but I'm going to skip to Michael Moon's. We're getting near the end, okay? So just don't get too fancy yet. Michael Moon's book, which just recently came out. Maybe some of you came here to see his lecture. It is a interesting. Now, whenever anybody uses the word interesting together, that's a cop-out word. So it is what he does is he comes up with parallel sorts of examples. There isn't really much examination of any of Darger's resources, even though he's titled it Darger's Resources. There are no resources in there of that Darger collected or did. What he did is he took parallel situations like the Bronte sisters and Branwell, their brother, how they published juvenilia. They wrote these sagas, these ongoing serialized sagas, that in the same way that Darger did, and how basically the Brontes continue to write this into adulthood, and he writes wonderfully about this. Darger probably knew nothing about the Brontes, but he offers this as a parallel situation. He writes about H.P. Lovecraft and the pulps. I love what he says about these things. These are ideas that I've been entertaining for a long time too. I emailed him and told him so. Told him that I liked what he did. But again, Darger was not reading H.P. Lovecraft. So in a sense, this is a misleading title. It should have been called Darger's Parallels to Darger's Work, or something like that, or something more poetic. It's a misnomer to call it Darger's Resources. What I did discover in there that was shocking to me was this particular passage about Blessed Anne Emmerich, which, and I'll skip, and basically this is an appropriated thing he uses in the realms. And jumping down to the bottom part, he says, to the canonical gospel scene of Jesus being scourged, and to Emmerich's gruesome and elaborate reimagining of the violent scene, Darger adds the remarkable, quote, detail, unquote, that the new Jesus becomes sexually aroused as he is scourged, and that the terrible pain he is already enduring is compounded by the shame he feels as his tormentors turn his body so that his erect penis is exposed to his mother's gaze. This is, in its conflicted way, one of the only explicit depictions of sexual self-consciousness and extreme embarrassment, interlined with infantile wish to expose one's erect penis to one's mother, that any of Darger's readers have reported discovering in his work. Well, when I read that, I thought, oh my God, I have never seen, and I've read many large portions of the realms. I've gone through most of it. I've never encountered this. I've never read of any other scholar encountering it. I went all through McGregor's work after I read that, because what is he talking about that any of Darger's readers have ever reported discovering in his work? Now, maybe he means by that nobody has ever discovered anything like that, which is true. I've never encountered this before. So I emailed him, and I asked him, where does he write this? Because up until now, for me, and for most scholars, McGregor included, explicit sexuality has never been part of Darger's work. Explicit violence, yes. Explicit, everything maybe. But yes, he's had erotic love scenes, ardent romantic scenes, never overt sexuality. So this was something new that I really wanted to. And of course, he does not footnote most of anything worthwhile in here. He makes blanket statements about many things that he never footnotes. We never know where he came. So I emailed him. I said, "Where did you come? Where is this? Tell me. I have to find this. I have to, this really, this is a new wrinkle in Darger scholarship." He says, "Oh, I'm sorry, but in the move from one house to another, I lost all of my materials." Well, okay. As I kept reading, I came to another thing that was even more disturbing to me. I mean, I didn't find the first disturbing, I found it enlightening. This was what I found disturbing. Darger and William Schloeder, the friend of his youth, made some attempts to adopt a child when they were themselves young men, but their efforts were unsuccessful. In our own time, when adoption by male couples is receiving widespread attention, we may anachronistically assume that the rejection of Darger and Schloeder's bid to adopt was in some sense fueled by what we would call homophobia. He makes repeated allusions to Darger and Schloeder being life partners wanting to adopt a child. This is patently false. There is nothing. Darger wanted to adopt a child. There are any number, and I sent back to the Folk Art Museum to go back. I have reproductions. I had them photocopy reproductions again for me because it had been, 12 years since I'd done a lot of this research for that first book, to make sure that Schloeder is never mentioned in anything. Darger wanted to adopt a child. So what Michael Moon is, what he's involved in some degree, is he and some other queer studies colleagues are involved in a kind of a reevaluation, a kind of a retro look at Darger's work, with the idea that Darger and Schroeder had a homosexual relationship. In doing more research on this, I came upon Jim Elledge's Henry Darger, Throwaway Boy. It's an unpublished biography of Darger. Elledge is one of Moon's colleagues, not at the university, but another queer studies scholar, a major. He's written, some 20 books within the realm of queer studies, and mostly dealing with artists who are gay and about their lives, and kind of putting that spin on their work, basically a gay biographical spin on this artwork, which has its place, certainly, but I discovered that this is the source of Moon's talking about Darger. So I was able to get a pre-publication copy. It's going to be published in July, and I've got to say, after I read this book, that it is a bombshell. This is the second groundbreaking work that has ever been done, next to McGregor's, because it overturns so many conceptions about what we've thought about Darger, that we will see him in an entirely new way after this book is published and is read. Now, nowhere in there does it come up conclusively and say that there is proof that Darger was gay. But he mounts such a persuasive and convincing case. His research, his meticulous research over 10 years on this subject, has elicited such an almost overwhelming argument that it's impossible not to entertain that idea. In the same way McGregor entertains the idea that Darger was a serial killer, we have to entertain, we must entertain the idea that Darger was a homosexual. But I think that Elledge does it in a non-irresponsible way. He is totally responsible for the research. I had some examples of it, but let me read one such piece. In Darger's book, Crazy House, Darger identifies this one character as being gay and then reveals himself as being gay too. Quote, this is from Darger. One cause mainly of the boy, Weber George, being bad was because he was angry at God for not having created him into a girl, which he wanted to be more than anything else. Then Darger adds, the reader may think this, his desire to be a female, is strange, but the writer, me, Henry Darger, knows quite a number of boys who would give anything to have been born a girl, and likewise, girls who wanted to be born boys. Okay, that's one example. Does it prove anything? No. It just means that the Darger is aware that he's aware that some boys would like to be girls and some girls want to be boys. Now, Crazy House is much more explicit sexually than and I've never read Crazy House. But Darger really, particularly after reading this book, convinces the reader that we have to view Darger in a much different light. To this degree, one of the Vivian girls is also in Crazy House. The Vivian girls, who has a penis and cross dresses, dances naked on the stage in a vaudeville theater. And after her act is over, she takes part in an orgy with naked men. Darger describes it this way, quote, this is from Darger's Crazy House. I found out last night Angeline Vivian went to act in that big vaudeville show on Halsted Street. She danced the Highland Fling on the stage with no clothes on and with a strong light revealing every motion. During intermission, she allowed naked boys to crowd around her to take her into their arms and to sit on their laps, and so on. Now, yes, this is suggestive stuff, and that's completely hetero, but throughout this whole book, he says that Well, the reason that the Vivian girls have penises, the reason why all the child slaves have penises is because they're not girls. They're girl boys. They're boys cross-dressing. They're boys cross-dressing as girls. And he maintains that throughout his arguments. It is really the best explanation for why these, I mean, we've come up with so many over the years. Yeah, he doesn't know anatomy. He doesn't know a girl from a boy. No, that didn't ring true, because we know that he, from all these disemboweled guts falling all over his work, we know that he's had anatomical works, that he had to have seen genitals of men and women. So that argument went out the window a long time ago. The one I've been using is that he was sexually confused, that it was gender confusion, because he had been raped continually in the institutions. He had been treated like a girl, and his only exposure was sex that way. So he just was messed up to start putting penises randomly on whoever. I was never happy with that explanation, but who's happy with a psychological illness that has no rational theory, has no rational explanation anyway? So, but this. And I have to say that Elledge's theory is not new. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, Dennis Adrian, major art critic here in Chicago, openly gay, said, "Oh, there's a simple reason why those girls have penises. They're not girls. They're boys." He said that from the get-go. It almost takes a gay scholar to recognize that, because that would be the first thing that would occur to him. Wouldn't be the first thing to occur to a heterosexual, at least, I guess. So, in any case, I'm not going to present his whole case for you, but take my word for it before you read his book that it is worth reading. It is worth checking out, because I'm not totally convinced that what he's saying is true. But he's got a damn good argument, and he's got a very persuasive one, and one that deserves to be publicized. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with quickly about what I've done, what the project I've been working on for 10 years myself, which has been the thing I wanted to do with the original 2000 book, which was to unite the words and images to do more with the text. Immediately after that book came out, I wanted to do a project where we would abridge the realms of the unreal. I have worked with Chris Lyon, the guy I worked with on the Rizzoli book that I did. He did the Prestel book for the Biesenbach book. I'm still working with him on it. We have come up between the two of us. There's been times when he wanted to get more scholars involved, when we want to just get a whole team and do an annotated version of the entire Realms of the Unreal in all 15,000 pages. How that would ever be published was beyond our ken at that point. And of course it still is. That becomes increasingly true, that it's never going to happen. Probably only online, probably only as a facsimile online. That's where it will ultimately, it's on microfilm now. It can be, some of it is digitized, most of it will be digitized in the end. And Christopher Lyon, who's now at Monticelli Press, is working on an app of the Darger room, where you can just press on different aspects of the Darger room, see all his images, and hopefully lots of his text. At some point, all that text will be available online. Now, over the years, what we came up with, I came up with the idea of doing, okay, how about this idea? And I spent a whole year abridging the first volume. And of course, what I did was I took the best parts of the first volume, and then I summarized portions of it in between. So we had text, and then I had summary paragraphs, text, summary paragraphs. I wasn't happy with it. Chris Lyon was really not happy with it. So that was a year wasted right there. He came up with the idea, let's do a book on just the Blangiculaminian serpents, the Blangans, the fairy-winged dragons. It's what everybody loves. It's safe. We can do a book just on Blangans. And you can maybe introduce a little violence into it. But it'd be largely a textbook, like a Wizard of Oz book with some illustrations, some images, but mostly text-driven. And it would be just on blankets. And if that works, if that sells, if there's a market for that, then we would do more books about the child slaves, about the Ehrenberg mystery, get into the heavier, deeper, edgier stuff. Ultimately, that never happened either. So this is what's happening now. I'm very close to signing a contract. I'm assured that it's coming in the mail within weeks. So I hope I'm not jumping the gun here. But it's my most recent proposal to do a 3-part, not an abridgment, because there's no way we'll be able to do an abridgment. It is the highlights of the realms of the unreal, the best parts, the most interesting episodes, which largely concern the Vivian Girls, the Ehrenberg Mystery, Penrod and Rattlesnake Boy, various little vignettes and episodes, interspersing them into 3 books, and then putting the usual weather conflagrations, the battle scenes, the carnage, getting a good dose of that throughout too. But basically this would be highlights, it would just all kind of fall together, but it would be highly arranged and selected and edited, like you would do to any professional author. This will not be, now many outsider purists will say, oh, but this is an abomination, this is not what Darger wants, this is not pure Darger. But I think I've come around, and the editors were there to begin with, and I hope the reader will come around to the idea that there's more than one way to deal with Darger. We don't have to treat Darger like an outsider. We can treat Darger like an author. Every author has an editor. Every author collaborates with a group of editors to make the best possible product. It's not like making visual art. Creating literature is not the same as creating art. Yeah, I can understand. You're not going to go into a visual art and say, no, you should paint this way. No, you should correct that. Yeah, you don't do that with art. But with literature, you do. Because it's very easy to make mistakes. It's very easy not to be able to know how to communicate. If we were to do Darger as he is, you would never want to read it. It is so overweening, overwrought, and so much of it is just boring and just not interesting. It is repetitive. I mean, you would not ever get through it. In this way, you will get through the best parts. It'll be put together and arranged in a way that hopefully will be interesting. So we'll be coming out with the first volume of that. If it sells, if it does well, there'll be maybe 2 or 3 other volumes after that. Hopefully that's what's in the works. That's what I'm involved with. And I thank you so much for your time. Can we take any questions or not?
We can open up to the audience for quick Q&A for about 10 minutes.
All right. Cleo.
I don't think I'm outing anybody, but McGregor was openly gay, and I never heard him address that idea.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
And Elledge contacted McGregor with his idea. And McGregor, I don't know what McGregor's response was, but what Elledge said was that, Elledge said, read Crazy House. He said, if you're going to find evidence for this anywhere, it's going to be in Crazy House. And so McGregor knew enough to point him in that direction, and he must have had suspected that, but for one reason or another, it was not something he wanted to pursue. I don't know why.
Is Crazy House one of the volumes in the Realms of the Unreal?
No. After he finished writing The Realms,
Okay.
he started a sequel,
Okay.
which is about a 5,000-page novel that takes place in Chicago. And basically the Vivian Girls are dealing with this haunted house, and it's called Crazy House. And some of the same characters, Penrod, all the Vivian Girls, many of the characters in the Realms, John Manley, some of them enter into that. But it's a more realistic setting. It's not in the Realms. It's here in Chicago, and it's more or less them dealing with demons and haunted, situations. And as I kind of pointed to, it's much more overtly sexual.
Is this work accessible to us?
No, it was handwritten. He never typed it up. It's a handwritten manuscript. And I don't think it's on any microfilm anywhere. You have to go to the Folk Art Museum.
It is actually, we have it in our library.
Oh, do you? It's on microfilm.
Yep.
There you go. Check it
Is,
out.
wait, is it illustrated?
No.
No.
It's not.
See, none of these works were illustrated. That was a whole separate thing he did.
Years later.
Okay, so the Realms of the Unreal is the only sort of big illustrated epic.
Well, he wrote it in 7 volumes bound, and in another 7, 6 or 7 volumes not bound, but they're typewritten manuscripts. And then separate from that, he's got these gigantic portfolios of 12-foot long images.
Right.
They were two entirely different things. He has a book where he describes scenes that he wants to do, some of which he did and didn't do, but they were never put together in any way. They're meant to go together in a way, but he didn't put them together in any fashion.
So the illustrations are not illustrations of, which is what you sort of were struggling with, is that they're not illustrations of the text.
They aren't, some are.
Yeah,
Some
some
are
are.
specific, some are, like I said, riffs. Many of them are of that
They're
place.
companion pieces almost. They're
Yes,
not-
yeah. And he continued to do this long after he stopped writing the realms. So he started kind of just riffing on that world.
And so, and when you have trouble locating a source that, this Michael Moos, that is saying, a piece of the text, it's because the text is so sprawling that you could, it's a,
It took me 6
Fatal.
months. It took me 6 months to turn every page
Yeah.
in all that stuff. And in the end, I was just skimming it, So, yeah, stuff that stuck out, I would stop, I'd make a note, I'd photocopy it. But, it took like I'm saying, I didn't want to spend another 6 months trying to find that piece.
and then is there a plan to digitize it?
Well, it's on microfilm. Ultimately, it will be. I think it will be digitized. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. Yes.
Yeah, when did he first start drawing? When did he first start drawing?
Well, we think that probably he started right at the same time, almost when he began writing. In about 1910 or 12, sometime between there, he began writing it. Now, it was a slow evolutionary thing. At first, he was using collages, and he was using... at first, he was just collaging, and he was doing freehand things, which didn't work. Ultimately, he gave those up and began tracing things instead. And so that took...
That was before he started writing?
No, he was writing all during that time. But he didn't start typing until 1916. He didn't give up the collages until at least 1918. During the 20s, he started tracing just headshot portraits of the characters, doing maps and flags. It wasn't until the 30s that he began to actually do the scenes. And those only began as small scenes in the 30s. By the 40s, he was doing larger scenes. By the 50s, he was doing the big 12-foot scenes. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I know the written works are available here, but is there a complete pictorial works of his anywhere? Like
A complete?
online?
No.
No?
No, you'd have to just buy all these books piecemeal, to encounter them. But like I said, the Wiesenbach book, I think, is probably my...
We're hoping that-
What?
I said, we're hoping that Kyoko gives us, the slides of the work. But
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah. So, yeah, they are available on slides, so at some point.
they're everywhere. They're in private collections, they're in museums, they're all over the place. So, those are the only images out there in the
I
world.
just figured Kyoko would have, taken pictures of it before split the collection apart.
I think most of that happened. Michael, do you know, I think, did Luber shoot everything before it was disseminated or not? Do you have any idea? Daniel Luber was an early photographer.
Lube? Daniel Lube?
Yeah, Luby.
No, there were 3 episodes of shooting. I did the first episode. Dan and I did the second. We continued on. And then the third one was with McGregor. I worked with him for a while on his book. The problem was that in the early days in my first adventure shooting, I had access to the room. I could go in there, and I would find that pages had been cut out of the books.
Yeah.
And one large page might have 3 separate sections, and one might have a panorama. And suddenly you found that in the middle of that section, one side had been cut out, and the panorama was destroyed.
Yeah.
And I asked, I was concerned, and I asked Nathan, said, well, we had Phyllis Kine come in here, and she said, I'd like to take some of these and see if I can sell them. I said, well, I haven't photographed them yet. We have to stop this. We have to somehow make a complete set. I recommended that we get a few students from the Art Institute, rent a panel truck, and you can come along, of course. Nathan, and will carefully move the work down to a large room with a tall ceiling at the art studio, and then horizontally shoot page by page, and get the order right, get everything right, and he said, well, no, I don't want to do that because I might damage the work, yada, 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 and he never went for that.
So there is a lot of work that was never photographed.
And the spines are around, aren't they?
One of the spines is, and you can see how it was sliced, and there are portions of the picture left on the spine. So it was not even done carefully. You know, it could have been unraveled
Sure.
if someone had taken the time to do it. But at that point, of course, nobody valued this work the way it is now. This was in the very early stages. You know, so we have to cut them some slack. Still,
Yeah.
these are professionals. This is an art dealer. You know, they all should have really known better, but they didn't. Yeah.
Just from your talk and things I've seen, why do you think so much more of the scholarship is focused on the art and not the text? Just
Because
it's so unavailable?
Not many people have read the text.
Okay.
You know, lots of people have seen the pictures.
Well, and I guess secondarily to that, I guess, especially in the time when this was becoming big, a time when things are being digitized, things are so technological, I guess, why has so much of the scholarship focused on that sort of secondary analysis as opposed to the getting the primary work out, I guess? Do you know why? I mean, I guess getting the primary work out, complementary to your question, seems like that would be the first agenda.
What do you mean by primary?
Actual text,
Okay.
digitizing that text. I mean, that seems
There
like
is
job one.
there has not been, I mean,
Yeah.
I've been passionate about it from the
Yeah.
get-go.
Yeah,
I mean, there are other people who are,
right.
but most people aren't because they love the images. They just, so there's not a demand, supply and demand.
So the autobiography somebody wrote a dissertation on his autobiography?
Yeah.
Okay, so there is a beginning to, academic scholarship
Yeah, yeah.
is going into
Right,
this.
yeah, it's happened, yeah, but it's been slower on that end.
Is